The young politician. When Muhammad Ali Jinnah was old and full of authority, he liked to relax in the company of young people with whom he would chuckle and joke with patience that he seldom offered his contemporaries. After he had listened to boy, students who came to him with their eager plans for improving the world, he would usually shake his finger at them and say, "Don't enter politics until you have made your pile." Jinnah had obeyed this dictum himself. He waited until 1906, when he was 30 years old and safe in his career and his fortune, before he began any active work in the political affairs of India. His first aim was the Indian National Congress. Mahatma Gandhi once said that it was a matter of the greatest pleasure to him that the Congress was first conceived in an English brain. The brain was that of Alan Octavian Hume, a secretary of the Indian government who realized the need for a national forum in which the picked men, the most highly educated of the nation, could meet each year to secure greater freedom, a more impartial administration, and a larger share in the management of their own country. On March 1, 1883, when Muhammad Ali Jinnah was still at school in Karachi, Hume had written a letter in which he said that if 50 men, good and true, can be found to join as founders, an Indian Congress could be established. He was no sentimentalist. He challenged the people of India to produce the 50 wise men who would renounce personal ease and pleasure for India's cause. "Let there be no more complaining of Englishmen being preferred to you," he wrote. If you lack that public spirit, that highest form of altruistic devotion that leads men to subordinate private ease to the public weal, that patriotism that has made Englishmen what they are, then rightly are these preferred to you, rightly and inevitably have they become your rulers. And rulers and taskmasters they must continue. Let the yoke gall your shoulders ever so sorely until you realize and stand prepared to act upon the eternal truth that self-sacrifice and unselfishness are the only unfailing guides to freedom and happiness. The Indian National Congress was formed with this lofty purpose, and the first session was opened in Bombay in 1885. The character of Congress did not continue in Hume's terms of altruistic devotion, and it soon yielded to the vagaries of human nature. The members sometimes allowed their egos to come first and the public weal second. It was nevertheless true that this noble hope for India's freedom and happiness was the image not of the Indians themselves, but of one of the English rulers and taskmasters. The founder members of Congress were mostly men who had been taught in English universities or by English teachers in India. During the early sessions, they showed no impatience with the slow, safe tempo of British reforms. Gopal Krishna Gokhale, afterwards a patron and friend of Jinnah, admitted that the present contract between India and England was a providential arrangement. W.C. Banerjee, the first president of Congress, said, "Much has been done by Great Britain for the benefit of India." He was grateful for the order, the railways, and the inestimable blessings of Western education. Dadabhai Naoroji, returned from his political enterprises in Westminster, spoke of the benefits of English rule, of the darkness of Asiatic despotism, and the light of free English civilization. These compliments were printed in English newspapers, and they salved the British conscience. There seemed no reason to suppose that more could be done for India. Doctors, nurses, missionaries, social workers, and teachers travelled out and spent the best years of their lives in the Indian hospitals and schools. There was much benevolence to cancel any selfish wish among the few who sought the rewards of profit or power. But the English had repeated in India the errors of their own educational reforms at home. The intellectual emancipation had begun at the top. Rural and primary schools, technical and industrial teaching were neglected. An Indian scholar wrote that a British pattern of character and education had been imposed on the upper classes, but nothing had been done to develop the indigenous ego of the Indian people. This higher education had bred a number of young political malcontents who spoke against their white overlords and of freedom from the shackles of British rule. In May 1905, they were encouraged by the victory of the Japanese over the Russians. The Viceroy reported that the news of this major conquest of white people by colored Asiatics reverberated through the whispering galleries of the East. The whispers became loud and defiant 5 months later when Bengal was partitioned, a measure that gave the bolder agitators the signal they needed. There were terrible outrages in East India and an organized boycott of goods imported from Britain. The rulers were forced into stern punishments and reprisals. One of the alarming effects of the Bengal episode was on the character of Congress, so mild in its policy up to then. The dramatic appeal of the extremists against the British startled all India, and to hold their own as a political force, liberal-minded men like G.K. Golkbale and Dadabhai Naoroji had to assume a more belligerent look. At the next meeting of Congress, the first attended by Jinnah, Gokhale denounced the government of India for its determination to dismember Bengal at all costs. He said that the measure arose from a decision to suit everything to the interests and convenience of the civil service. Gokhale first recalled the inauguration of Congress in 1885 under the influence of a remarkable outburst of enthusiasm for British rule. At the end of his speech, he announced a lively change of policy. He said, "Above all, there is a general perception now of the goal towards which we have to strive. The goal of the Congress is that India should be governed in the interests of the Indians themselves, and that in course of time a form of government should be attained in this country similar to what exists in the self-governing colonies of the British Empire." The story of the political currents that flowed in this time is told in 100 books of reference. It is necessary only to describe those immediate events that must have influenced Jinnah at this important period of his life when, having made his pile or the foundations of it, he decided to enter politics. It might seem that the old astrologer in Karachi was still busy with his prophetic scratchings in the dust, busy arranging the pattern of coincidences in Jinnah's life. He had been born only a few days before Queen Victoria was proclaimed Kaisar-i-Hind. He arrived as a student in London in the year of Mr. Gladstone's last great Liberal victory, the year of Dadabhai Naoroji's election to Parliament. In 1906, when Jinnah decided to enter politics, the Liberals were again in power in England, with Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman as Prime Minister, Mr. John Morley as Secretary for India, and 6 members of Parliament who were Anglo-Indians, pledged to the cause of freedom in the country they knew so well. On February 26, 1906, John Morley said in the Commons, "This Parliament presents a considerable number already of new features, and it is a new feature, and one, I think, on which we ought to congratulate ourselves, that this afternoon we have had 6 maiden speeches in succession from gentlemen who have shown themselves possessors of a competent knowledge of Indian subjects. I think a debate of this kind can do nothing but good to this country and also to our interests in India." The debate on the partition of Bengal and the unrest in India had inspired each of these 6 new members to make a long speech, explaining India's misfortunes and needs as they had never been presented to the Commons before. The text of the speeches must have been heartening to readers of the Times of India next morning, and Muhammad Ali Jinnah must have noted all this with satisfaction. He may have read Sir Henry Cotton's statement that sympathy is the keynote of successful administration in India, and Sir John Jardine's plea that the natives of the country should be employed in the administration of the country as much as possible and as far as was consistent with good government. This disturbing debate in the British Parliament coincided with Jinnah's first active move in the politics of his own country. During the important 1906 session of the Indian Congress held in Calcutta, he was private secretary to Dadabhai Naoroji. He had heard his old master in Westminster 14 Yeats before, speaking of British justice and generosity, Now he listened to him declaring, "All our sufferings of the past centuries demand before God and men reparation." The British people would not allow themselves to be subjected for a single day to such an unnatural system of government as the one which has been imposed upon India for nearly a century and a half. We do not ask favours. We only want justice. Instead of going into any further divisions or details of our right as British citizens, the whole matter can be comprised in one word: self-government, or Swaraj. So, the grand old man, the once gentle mediator of the Finsbury electorate, now in his 81st year, became a warrior. His slogan, Swaraj, our Raj, was writ on the new banner of Congress. Behind the banner marched Jinnah at the age of 30, with most of the attributes of great reformers. Those attributes have been described as immense enthusiasm, a desire for adventure, a powerful persuasiveness, a keen sense of the spirit and the requirements of the day, and a certain mysticism. Jinnah had all these, except mysticism. His advent into public life, with this small role at Dadabhai Naoroji's heels, was welcomed by all except his admirer, Mrs. Naidu, who wrote, "Hey, what has happened to this beautiful boy? Why has he meddled in politics?" The old Parsi lady, still living in Bombay, recalls both Jinnah and Mrs. Naidu during this year when the advocate became the young politician. "Yes," she has said, "I remember Sarojini Naidu. She was in love with Jinnah, but he was never in love with her. He was cold and aloof. His career was all that mattered to him. She wrote love poems to him, but he was not the man to be enticed by romantic verses. He was fastidious and virtuous, and he spent his evenings with his law court briefs. They used to call Mrs. Naidu the Nightingale of Bombay. I am afraid that, as far as Jinnah was concerned, she sang in vain." The extravagance of Mrs. Naidu's devotion must have been embarrassing to a man of Jinnah's nature. She wrote, "In the noontide hours, O love, secure and strong, I need thee not. But in the desolate hour of midnight, when it's an ecstasy of starry silence sleeps, on the still mountains and the soundless deeps, and my soul hungers for thy voice." Mrs. Naidu's conception of Muhammad Ali Jinnah was overcolored. The true portrait of him at this time has an El Greco look, with grey, cold depths, lean, pale hands, which he washed almost every hour, and eyes that searched into a man's conscience. Except for the heavy lips, his face was that of a zealot, a Puritan, but one who made no laws for others that he did not already keep himself. There is a vague story that Jinnah made a speech in Congress on the opening day of the 1906 session. But there is no proof of this. No words are recorded to let us know what was in the mind of the calm, relaxed figure, who was so curiously free from those extremes of emotion usually found in his race. When another old friend of this time was asked, "But was Jinnah absolutely without passion?" he answered, "It may sound ridiculous, but I believe his only passion was for newspapers. He had them sent from all over the world. He cut pieces out of them, annotated them, and stuck them into books. He would do this for hours, all through his life. He loved newspapers." The habit endured 40 years later, even when he was dying, the eager interest in what was happening, everywhere. Always he was to peer ahead. The past had no allure for him. When he went to see one of the great Parsi aristocrats of Bombay in his fabulous palace by the sea, Jinnah would hurry through the galleries thronged with treasures, ancient bronzes brought from southern India, and exciting, delicate Mughal paintings. All he sought was a sofa in a corner where he could ensnare his host and talk politics at him rather than with him late into the night.